The Thursday, June 27, 2019 regular meeting of the Brisbane Planning Commission will now come to order. May I have roll call, please?
Commissioner Gomez?
Here.
Commissioner Gooding?
Here.
Commissioner Mackin?
Here.
Commissioner Sayasan?
Here.
The record show Commissioner Patel is absent.
Adoption of the agenda. May I have a motion to adopt the agenda, please?
I make a motion.
I'll second.
All in favor?
Aye.
Aye. Consent calendar. Is there anyone who would like to remove an item from the consent calendar? I see no one. May I have a motion to adopt, please?
So moved.
Second.
All in favor?
Aye.
Aye. Oral communications. Is there anyone who would like to address the Commission about an item that's not on tonight's agenda? I see no one. We'll move to written communications. I have 5 letters here from members of the community supporting one of our public hearings tonight regarding 133 Monterey Street. The letters are from Marcella Avon, Willa Cantillon, Karen Bremer, William Kettle, Abria, and Jeff Amendola, and James Sotomayor. Okay. So we'll start, we'll begin now with the public hearing, and it concerns 133 Monterey Street, R-1 Residential District, Use Permit UP-3-19. This is a use permit to allow conversion of an existing detached garage into an accessory dwelling unit, eliminating 1 of 2 required parking spaces for the main dwelling unit. James and Mia Christie are the applicant owners. Staff, can we have a report?
Yes, thank you, Chair. So the application before you tonight is for a use permit to allow non-conforming parking, to allow 1 off-street parking space to serve an existing 2-bedroom, 838 square foot single-family dwelling, where 2 off-street spaces are required by the code. One of the existing 2 spaces on the site would be eliminated by conversion of an approximately 250 square foot detached garage into an ADU. So here's just take you through some photos to orient you to this site. This is a view of the subject property from Monterey Street looking to the south. So you can see here the shared driveway between the property, the subject property at 133 and the property next door at 141 Monterey. You can also see at the back of that shared driveway the garage structure that they're proposing to convert to an ADU. And then to the left-hand side in this picture, it's 110 Alvarado is identified. And you can see as well the existing power pole that's right in the middle of the property's frontage on Monterey Street. So this is a substandard lot in regards to size, width, and depth. And it's currently developed again with a 2-bedroom single-family dwelling, detached 1-car garage. Development on the site complies with the floor area ratio. It slightly exceeds the lot coverage maximum, so it's existing non-conforming in regards to the lot coverage. The garage itself is also located in the rear and side setbacks, so the location of that is non-conforming in regards to setbacks. Other development on the site includes the patios and decks shown here in these photos. This photo also shows the parking space that will be retained on the site, which is in tandem to the garage. And then, of course, the front yard is landscaped. So currently, the property does meet the 2 parking space requirement on site. So, of course, as stated, by converting the garage to an ADU, while the ADU itself does not require a parking space, it would be eliminating a required space for the house, hence why they had to apply for a use permit to modify the parking regulations for the single-family home. So here's a site plan. And here are the applicants' as-built existing floor plans for the single-family dwelling, which is not proposed to change, and the proposed floor plans for the accessory dwelling unit. So in order to approve a use permit to modify the parking regulations, the Commission has to make several findings. a few of which are the general use permit findings in regards to compatibility with adjacent uses and structures, general plan policies, and regarding impacts to health and safety and the general welfare. So in regards to those general use permit findings, as detailed in the staff report, the application does meet those findings. The single-family use with accessory dwelling unit is considered still a single-family use consistent with the general plan land use designation as well as the underlying zoning district. The surrounding uses and structures include other single-family homes, some of which also have accessory dwelling units in the surrounding neighborhood. And when it comes to the general health safety and general welfare, this, of course, the project would require a building permit and compliance with all health and safety regulations, including for fire rating, walls and windows. Anything that comes with making an uninhabitable structure habitable would be required as part of the permit process. And then for use permits specific to modifying parking regulations, there are several other parking-specific findings that have to be made. So the first being which that should the use permit be granted, strict enforcement would not be required on the city's behalf to ensure that there would not be any undesirable conditions. In this case, again, no additional parking is required to serve the accessory dwelling unit. That's under our Muni Code as well as the state laws that govern how we regulate ADUs. The project would retain one on-site parking space for use by the property owner. And when it comes to accessing that parking space, we've inserted a condition of approval in the resolution just to ensure that the space is continued for permanent use as parking and isn't obstructed with fencing or any other physical obstruction. Of course, any expansion that may be proposed for the single-family dwelling in the future would trigger parking requirements. So again, this is not an intensification of the single-family home use, so the request is to reduce the amount of parking specific to the single-family home. The second finding is that granting the permit would not create or intensify a shortage of on-street parking, given the availability of existing or improved on or off-street parking, which may not fully meet the requirements of the BMC. So in regards to this finding, as stated in the staff report, Commission has generally found, and the community has often voiced, the perception that street parking is at a premium in central Brisbane. Many residential streets, neighbors feel impacted when it comes to the availability of on-street parking. So we'll qualify that as an existing shortage of on-street parking. In this specific block, as detailed in the staff report, the property bordering this property to the east, 110 Alvarado, which fronts and is accessed from Alvarado Street, has about 85 feet along the street frontage that's available for street parking. That's unbroken by driveways or or street trees or any other obstructions. So it's a fairly unique situation on any block in town to have that much uninterrupted length of area for parking, and it can accommodate about 5 spaces. So in this instance, while for a variety of reasons I'll go into in just a moment, there's no code compliant space that can be located along the frontage of this property. There is street parking that's available in the immediate vicinity. And lastly, the Commission must find that full compliance with the parking requirements is not reasonably feasible due to existing structural or site constraints. So as detailed in the staff report and shown on the site plan annotated by staff, the property's frontage is insufficient to accommodate a code compliant space. We require at least 37.5 feet of frontage to credit an on-street parking space to your off-street requirements. Secondly, the front yard is insufficient in width and depth to accommodate a compliant parking space. We don't allow cars to block sidewalks in Brisbane. It's not permitted by code, at least. So that's not an option either. Of course, the shared driveway with 141 Monterey Street being only about 12 feet wide does not have sufficient room for parking within it that would not impede access to either 133 or 141 Monterey Street. So there are parking areas. And lastly, the remaining portion of their rear yard is developed with patios, decks, and a garden area to accommodate their outdoor living space. So with that, staff is recommending conditional approval of the application subject to the findings and conditions contained in the approving resolution. And I'll take any questions.
Thank you. Does anyone have questions for staff? Commissioner Mackin.
Just one, Julie, if you could. You said there were potentially 5 spaces by 110 Alvarado. Is there, again, would you go over, is there a street tree within that particular area? By the photograph, the aerial view, it looks like there's at least 1, but there's still 5 spaces?
So there is one. Yeah, the best view is, so from the...
Looking east.
Yeah,
it
looking
shows.
east. If this can be seen. So this tree here is actually, as far as we can tell, right about on the shared property line between 133 and 110. So that doesn't obstruct necessarily any, so there's no parking happening between the power pole and the tree here.
Mm-hmm.
But parking further to the east of that tree is all along here. The second tree that's shown is almost at the front yard for Alvarado. And as you can see, cars are parked basically right around it.
So do we have any idea between the 2 trees
What that distance is?
how many, either the distance or how many spaces are between those trees?
Just based on the photos that
Well, I guess what I'm getting at is
I didn't calculate.
whether you measured 5 spaces by a certain uniform measurement or whether it was an eyeball of you could probably fit 2 cars, but you might be able to fit 3 cars between the trees.
Yeah, so the approximation of how many cars could fit there was based on the length of the lot line and the observed fact of cars basically parking around the street tree without impeding any additional cars basically in between it. But no, we did not map out exactly how much space was available in between the 2 street trees.
Okay,
In the
thank
street.
you.
Any other questions? I have one question, Julia. So even after, if we were to grant their request, currently they're not in conformity with regards to the lot coverage, and we don't require them to be in conformity after the changes. I thought if someone wanted to make changes to their house, that any changes then they'd have to fix any nonconformity.
So that's true when it comes to like additions.
Mm-hmm.
So if you have, for example, if they wanted to add on to their house because their overall lot coverage is already non-conforming, they would only be able to build within the footprint of existing structures. So they'd increase their floor area potentially, but not increase their lot coverage. But no, in a case where there's existing non-conforming structures, they're allowed to persist. They can be, the interior use of those spaces can be modified. If they were to demolish a structure, or if anyone was to demolish a structure and then try to rebuild it in its condition and it was a non-conforming in regards to lot coverage, that wouldn't be allowed. There's only a few cases where people are allowed to totally rebuild structures that may be contributing to non-conforming lot coverage, and that's basically an event of a disaster. That's the only time they'd be allowed to totally rebuild. But no, you can modify the interior use.
Okay, thank you. Any questions? Okay, then we'll open up the public hearing. Would the applicant like to address the commission?
First off, thank you, commissioners, for serving our city, and also thank you to the city staff. Before going through this process, I had no idea how much work our staff did, so I just want to express my appreciation for what you do for our city and for what you did for our application. Thank you. First off, I'd just like to begin to tell you why my wife and I are choosing to build an ADU or convert our garage to an ADU. My wife and I love Brisbane. We moved here 3 years ago, and being able to do this allows us to have the passive income for it to be financially feasible for us to continue living here. As I'm sure you all are very well aware, it can be challenging for people to continue living here in our community because of the price of housing. particularly people who serve our communities, police officers, firemen, clergy, teachers. As I think many of you know, I am a clergy person. I work in hospice. I love doing it, and because of 3 different, I would say, miracles, my wife and I were able to get a home here in Brisbane. And so not only would that, the conversion allow us to stay here, but it also allows us to stay here and it to be financially reasonable for us to have children. And we're really excited at a prospect of raising children here in our community. In terms of our application, we went around to our neighbors. Each of our next door neighbors wrote letters in support. As you went through in the report, there were also 2 additional letters on top of the 5 you mentioned supporting the applicant. I believe it was a total of 10 of our neighbors told us they supported the project. Every neighbor we went to supported the project. And these are all the homes that are closest to us and would be most likely to be impacted at all by the removal of an on-site parking space. The on-site parking space that currently remains, we actually aren't currently utilizing. So my wife's Prius is currently in the garage, and once we start construction, she will start utilizing that space. So my wife and I will not be ourselves adding a car to the street. I don't know if the commission wants me to rehash the staff's analysis, but yeah, we've got a very tiny lot. There's the shared driveway. There's already development of 2 patios in the backyard. Our front yard, which I'm proud to say has native plants that my wife planted. It's not big enough to have a parking space. On top of the fact that we have a pole, a telephone pole right there. So Mia, yeah, please add. Yeah.
Thanks. They're not all native plants. I just don't want that to become a topic of debate.
Yeah, okay.
But so one of the things that came up during this project is, why wouldn't we just remove part of the backyard deck area to create a space? And so, that is something that we're kind of well known for in our neighborhood. We've had, even before we lived there, there's always been a lot of plants that have grown in the flower box next to the deck. And so, it's just something we benefit from, our next door neighbor at 141 benefits from. If we were to take that out, we would lose, our outdoor living space to, half of it basically. So that's why we didn't include that in our proposal and our plan. And, otherwise, if we did put that one in, if we did remove that, it would create like a very tight space that, anyway, I don't want to go into too much detail about that, but it wouldn't be that usable, to be honest. So might as well keep the deck that we have. So, but yeah, we, again, like James said, our neighbors were all in support, and, we wanted to make sure we followed the rules and we went through the proper channels, so that's why we applied for the permit. So I really, really appreciate that you're taking time out of this meeting to review it and all the effort that went into preparing the report. So thank you, everyone.
Okay, thank you. Stay there in case one of us has questions for you.
I did.
Commissioner Gomez.
James and Mia, thank you for coming out.
Yeah, you're welcome.
This is just a observation. I've walked down the street several times and I've read the staff's analysis. So and I understand that's a narrow shared driveway. Theoretically, a compact car could park in there, though.
Oh yeah. Oh, you mean in the driveway?
Theoretically.
It would be blocking our neighbor's access to one of his parking spots.
So it'd be blocking your neighbors.
Yeah.
Okay. That was what I was trying to verify.
Dave wouldn't like
what
that.
the relationship.
We'd have to agree that we're going to do that and time it.
Yeah. Okay. I was just pondering.
That's a good idea.
I have, neighbors do interesting things to accommodate each other's needs, right? So,
yeah.
Okay.
Thank you.
That's all I have. Yeah.
Commissioner Mackin? Commissioner Gooding?
Just one quick question. You mentioned that the car you currently keep in the garage, you'll be likely parking in the off-site open space. Are there any other cars of the family that are currently being parked in the neighborhood?
I have a car, and there's kind of a gentleman's agreement among our neighbors that you allow the person who lives in the residence to park in front of there. And also because of the telephone pole, it's a substandard space, so you would either need a Mini or a small Prius. I think that's actually the main reason why the spot's always open.
So that stretch of fence that's longer on the right-hand side, that's where he parks in front of that. And so only certain size cars can fit there.
Thank you.
Yeah.
I have one question. So it does look like, most of your neighbors support this and, they think they have no objections. But we did receive one letter from, I'm assuming he's a neighbor and he had concerns about this contributing to, the parking issue. So what has been, I don't know if you've talked to any neighbors that have opposed this? Or?
Well,
we don't know
We
him.
don't know who he is, and so we're not 100% sure if he actually lives on Monterey. I read his letter, and I believe he doesn't fully understand our application. He said, if I remember correctly, he said that we should not be eliminating on-street parking. I believe he said that in his opening line, and as you know from our application, we're not eliminating any on-street parking.
He said off-street.
Oh, off-street parking. Yeah, that was my own misunderstanding, and again, we don't even know if he lives on our street.
Okay. Any other questions?
Actually, unless I missed something, I didn't see that letter.
In the packet?
It was one of the attachments?
Yeah, it was in the attachments.
Okay. I must have missed that.
Attachment E.
Okay.
Any questions for the applicant? None? Okay, thank you.
Thank you.
Okay, Barbara Ebel?
Hi, Barbara Ebel, longtime Brisbane resident. I have in my hand here a file from 2012 when the Planning Commission, led by Karen Cunningham, tried to change our regulations to require 2 parking spaces per bedroom. I spoke vehemently against that over several meetings, but I'm really not in favor of having 1 parking space for 2 bedrooms either. James and Mia are wonderful people, and I'm sorry to have to stand up here and oppose them. I know all their neighbors support them. I feel like neighbors often feel obligated to support each other. But if there's one thing I know about Brisbane, from living in Brisbane all these years, is Brisbane loves its parking. And so I promise you there are people out there who just don't want to be unpleasant neighbors, who don't want this, and they're just not saying it. And unfortunately, I'm always the person who comes up here and sticks my foot in it regardless. We have a project too, and we asked if we could put a 4,000-gallon tank in the rear setback. We were told no, because there are no above-ground structures allowed in rear setbacks. I thought it was a pretty good idea because it would have been completely invisible from the street, completely invisible from our property, but it wasn't the rules. And so we dropped it. And maybe we could have pushed it. We could have come before you and we could have asked for that, because I do believe that a 4,000-gallon rainwater tank would have been in keeping with the city's values. And like I said, it would have been completely invisible from the street, the neighbors, even the residents. But like I said, it didn't work out, or maybe it could have worked out, but we didn't push it. If James and Mia wanted to add a unit above their garage, I think that would be definitely a better solution. I'm sure it would cost more money, but that's kind of the way construction goes. You put in more than you want, and then you get something out of it. So I guess my point is that I don't feel like there's extenuating circumstances for granting this variance. I mean, maybe they are, and I just don't see it, but that's my belief in this. That's my personal judgment in this situation, and you guys are going to make a decision. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Is there anyone else who would like to speak? I see no one. Can I have a motion to close the public hearing?
Move we close the public hearing.
I second.
All in favor?
Aye.
Aye. Okay. Who would like to start?
You're looking at me, I'll start.
Okay.
So I appreciate the applicant that you mentioned. You looked at your deck in the back, because I sat for probably an hour looking at your yard and trying to figure out how you could put additional parking in there. And also the one illustration shows that you can put parking in front of the garage without impeding your neighbor's access to the driveway. As for the utility pole in the front and that not being then a conforming spot, I actually did a little measuring of different vehicles, and 15 feet, which that measurement is from driveway to pole, is more than adequate for a lot of cars, not just minis. You park right up against the pole, there's probably at least 50% of the cars will fit in that spot without impeding anyone. So I think this is a really tough decision, because I appreciate what Missy Bell said about going up. That would actually be a good idea. I don't know if that would be legal, because of the setback in the back is very, very small, and there could be a reason why that wouldn't even be feasible. I don't understand what the construction constraints are, but I will say we're trying to promote ADUs, and I believe that 15-foot spot in the front meets the criteria for being an off-street parking spot.
So you're inclined to grant it?
Yes.
Anyone else like to chime in?
I want to point out, I think that technically speaking, to Ms. Evil's presentation, this is not really a request for a variance. It's a request for a use permit that staff indicates is an appropriate application under the circumstances, or at least under their interpretation of the municipal code, in view of the rules or the regulations governing ADUs. So it's a technical matter. It's not a variance, and we shouldn't be applying those kinds of standards. It's just whether the application warrants the kinds of findings that would support a use permit.
And do you have a position on it?
I think I agree with Commissioner Mackin. It's a tough one. I don't like reducing parking in an area where parking is an issue, but we have such a horrific housing shortage here and everywhere else that the addition of an ADU is a good that I think outweighs the bad in this case.
Okay, thank you. Commissioner Gomez?
Yeah, and I guess closing out, this is an extremely difficult assessment, and you look at the premium of parking in our community, I think that goes without saying. You look at the trends from San Jose up to San Francisco with new developments, with promoting ADUs, acknowledging that we do have a significant housing crisis. There's lots of construction that is reducing the amount of required parking as stipulated in the various municipal codes. I think that the inherent effort here is to provide additional housing. I think that is a very good thing. I understand the give and take with the parking. I think that's a very good observation, though, that the front does allow for a compact car. I'm very optimistic that as we have more ADUs, I'll use the term deployed in the city, that it's going to, and I'll use the word force, it's going to force people to look at how they approach transportation. And as you look at some of the broader economic trends of companies, ride-sharing companies, heck, I'll even go down the path of driverless cars and different ways of getting from point A to point B. I think that we're going to see a lot of transformation in this space. So from my perspective, I think this is a reasonable request, and that's where I stand.
Okay, thank you. I also agree this is a tough one. I mean, one of the fact findings that we have to make here is that in granting this, we don't create a situation where the health or welfare, the comfort of the neighborhood is impacted. So, by taking away a parking space, it would, I understand, impact the parking in the area. But at the same time, we have a shortage of housing and affordable housing, and that's something, that would be helpful to the Brisbane community to, so if we granted this and there's another dwelling unit that someone could, be offered to someone to live here, I think that would be a benefit. And, and the neighbors have spoken. I mean, a good portion of the neighbors have written in and stated that they didn't feel that their welfare would be impacted. There's obviously some opposition as well, but I think probably in weighing the benefits of the ADU, in weighing, I think the majority of the neighbors support this. I'm inclined to grant this as well. So, Commissioner Mackin.
I just wanted to add one thing. Were that 15 feet not available, if that was 10 or 11, I would vote no. To me, you're saved by that 15 feet, because even if it's not totally compliant, to say that there's no parking in front is really not true. There is. It may not be standard parking that the city is looking for in regulations for your frontage parking, but to me that's the fine little detail there. Thank you.
Okay, then can we have a motion? Commissioner Mackin?
I move that we adopt use permit UP 3-19 for 133 Monterey Street.
I second.
All in favor?
Aye.
Aye.
Thank you. Congratulations.
Thank you.
Okay, next item on the agenda is a public hearing regarding 800 to 1800 Sierra Point Parkway, SP-CRO Sierra Point Commercial District, sign review SR-7-19. And this is the applicant is seeking a sign review to establish a sign program for the HCP Biotechnology Campus. Justin Lawrence is the applicant. HCP LS Brisbane LLC is the owner. Staff, may we have a report?
Yes, thank you. Just to go. The applicant requests a sign program for the HCP R&D campus at 800 to 1800 Sierra Point Parkway. The sign program or sign programs allow for sign regulations to be established on a site-specific basis for large or multi-tenant sites, such as this campus. The sign program would regulate site-wide signage, with the exception that no signage was proposed for the garage and retail liner structure. It's hard to see in this image, but that's located on the northeast corner of this site. The applicant has indicated that they'd like to follow up with the Planning Commission as a separate application, as an addendum later, that they're not prepared to address that portion of the site yet. The campus will have 5 R&D buildings, plus a parking garage with retail liner, as I mentioned. And this is on a 23-acre site along that southern edge of Sierra Point. Construction of the campus commenced last year and is ongoing for the first 2 buildings, and the other buildings have permit applications in process. The proposed sign program consists of the written portion, which defines the regulatory approval process, plus the graphics package, which either depicts the various signs, or in the case of the tenant signs, it provides parameters such as type, size, and location, along with the regulatory framework for future approvals of those. The proposed program includes the following general sign types: ground signs. These include a single site monument and 3 entry drive monuments. Also included are wayfinding signs such as tenant identification, vehicle directional signs, pedestrian directional signs, and directional signs for the cafe. There's 3 flagpoles that are proposed behind the site monument, one each for the American flag, California flag, and the site identification flag. Wall signs, which are to identify the major tenants of the building from a distance, are included. Those the wall signs provisions in the sign program address the sizes and locations, as I've mentioned, but not the individual signs that would be proposed at a future date for planning director approval on a case-by-case basis. And then there's code signs, which include the address signs on each building and vehicle code signage, which is really governed by the California Building Code. Also our Bay Trail signs, which are within the jurisdiction of BCDC for approval, and they've already weighed in on those. The sign program text also includes as I mentioned, the regulatory framework. So the general permitting procedures are included in that, as well as exceptions, how those are handled, and performance standards. And the following are a few images showing the sampling of signs that are included. And there's, as you saw in the packet, there are something like 70 different pages of images. So this is just a quick sampling. Here you have the site monument, the shore, and here it is in a photo simulation. And this is the map of that corner. So in dark you have where that would be located, and then behind it the 3 flagpoles. These would be the entry drive monuments, so 3 driveways into the site, so 1 for each. And then you have, this is, I'm having a hard time seeing from this distance, but vehicle directional. And cafe, that did both on that one. So this is interior to the site now, not at the site edges. And then pedestrian directional. And then the tenant ID signs, which would be essentially a monument sign out in front of each building with different parameters. If you had a tenant that occupies the whole building, you'd have the example on the left. And then if there's a tenant per floor, you would have the example on the right. And this shows an example of a wall sign. So the upper portion shows where that sign would sit on that westernmost building. And then you have the detail page that's on the bottom part there. So again, this part would be subject to separate application to the planning director, and it would stay within those size parameters, and these would be face-lit signs. Address signs, so we have primary at the entrance to the buildings in the upper, and then smaller and painted essentially would be the secondary signs, because these buildings can be approached from multiple sides. And then you have the code signage, so on the top the ADA parking, which again is governed by the CBC, and then the Bay Trail, both directional and also educational signage. That educational signage you've seen, I'm sure, as you've walked along the Bay Trail at other locations. So in order to grant a sign program, the Planning Commission must make certain findings as provided in the municipal code. The application would meet all of the required findings as detailed in the agenda report. In brief, the program would allow for signs that are well suited to the site and neighborhood and provide for a cohesive palette of signs that fit well with the buildings and grounds. And that's in terms of style, scale, colors, and materials. The palette is modern with brushed aluminum cabinets or monuments, along with color palette of blues and whites. Additionally, the signage would not create glare hazards or distractions. It would provide for necessary wayfinding and building identification. As a final note, the application has been routed to the various responsible city departments and agencies, and no concerns were raised. Building permits, as I mentioned, or building permits would be required prior to actual installation. So in closing, staff recommends approval of sign program SR 719, the adoption of the resolution containing both the findings, conditions, but also the exhibits of the text and graphics package.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Any questions for staff? Commissioner Gooding?
Thank you. Ken, I have just a sort of a general question. Compared to the other developments already in place at Sierra Point, is this signage plan significantly different in either scope or size of the signage? Or is it consistent generally with the others?
The size of the signage is consistent, if not smaller. Actually, on the buildings, for example, in this zone, we would allow 6 foot height on the buildings so that they could be seen from the freeway. The applicant has indicated that 4 is adequate for their needs. So it's a slightly smaller, actually, which is different. The monument signs are of a similar scale, except the site monument, the one at the corner, we don't have an example of that really, except John's going to add here.
I'd say the difference is, the campus format of this particular project is different than the other buildings at Sierra Point, which are pretty much standalone. So you didn't have necessarily the need for some of the internal wayfinding and identification. So in that sense, it's different, different kind of program and a different purpose. But as Ken mentioned, the scale and the signage is quite similar or downscaled a little bit from what else exists out there.
Thank you. So, yeah, I'm not too. What's inside the campus is kind of what's inside their campus and visible only by their users. But is there anything outside on the street side that is, meaningfully different from elsewhere in Sierra Point?
I would say no. It's very consistent in terms of size and also type, that they're all monument signs.
Okay. Thank you.
Commissioner Mackin?
Ken, if you would, start on page 35, which shows an exterior view, entry monument, M2B rendering. And I'd call your attention to the signage that appears at an entryway to the parking lot. And let me know when you're there. Page 35.
Okay. Sorry, we have two different sets of page numbers here.
Okay.
So, again, this is entry monument M2B rendering.
Yes, right. Okay, so in looking at that rendering, you see the driveway going into the parking lot with the signage shown on the far side of that driveway, right?
Or the near side. I'd have to go back to the...
Well, so here's part of the question. So if we compare that to page 25, which is the sign location plan, it shows M2B on the near side of the driveway, which was just a peculiarity. It's not a huge detail, but it got to me thinking about something else. Does anyone give thought to placement of these signs? It's indicated as being 5 feet high, and whether a car trying to exit has a sight line impaired, or a car entering, other cars in the lot can't see that car entering. So what I'm suggesting here is that by putting the sign right almost on top of the driveway really impedes the sight lines. And if they were actually way before or a little bit after, it opens up the sight line so you don't have a problem for cars entering or exiting or cars moving through that parking lot, not seeing traffic. Not that I'm expecting massive amount of traffic or problems, and maybe I'm being excessively concerned, but I just wondered if anyone ever looks at that, because that caught my eye. I would not want to have that sign in my way.
Right. So this was specifically looked at. They have vision triangles that the Public Works Department specifically looked at each of these to make sure that they fit with the engineering standards for approval, so they were looked at.
Okay, great. That's reassuring. Thank you.
Any other questions? Okay, thank you. We'll open the public hearing now. Would the applicant like to speak?
You can approach the microphone. They may have questions for you if you wanted to.
Hello.
Hi.
Hi.
State your name, please.
Justin Lawrence.
Oh, okay. So anybody have any questions for the applicant? Okay, actually, we do not have any questions. Okay, thank you. Does anyone else is there anyone else who would like to speak? Okay, I see no one. May I have a motion to close the public hearing?
So moved.
I second.
All in favor?
Aye.
Aye. Okay, anyone have anything to say? I mean, I'm inclined to approve it unless there's any
Pretty straightforward.
Okay.
Can I just make a comment?
Sure.
I think the signage is attractive. I think it's well thought. In its simplicity, it's not overdone. I read about the illumination with the LEDs, and I was impressed by the fact you have a dimmer switch so that you're not wasting energy. So I think it was really well planned.
Okay. Yeah, I agree with all the findings and analysis in the staff report, and I don't see any reason to not approve it. So can I have a motion to approve?
Yeah, I make a motion to approve SR-7-19.
Okay.
I second that.
All in favor?
Aye.
Aye. Okay, thank you. Okay, next is a public hearing regarding zoning text amendment RZ-1-19. And this is a zoning text amendment to Chapter 17.32 and Chapter 17.36 of Title 17, Zoning of the Brisbane Municipal Code, to add Section 17.32.260 concerning election signs, providing new regulations for election signs, and amending Section 17.36.020 definitions to provide a cross-reference to the new election signs section. City of Brisbane is the applicant. Staff, can we have a report?
Yes, thank you. This application is a city-initiated zoning text amendment to add new election sign provisions to the municipal code. In recent election cycles, campaign committees have asked about what regulations apply to placement of campaign signs. And increasingly, campaigns seem to have more funds for getting out the message. In light of that trend, the proposed election sign ordinance would provide direction to candidates and ballot measure campaigns. For the purpose of the proposed ordinance, an election sign would be defined as shown here. It is not considered a commercial advertising sign, but rather it is of a political nature that directly relates to a candidate or a ballot measure in a government-held election. There are 5 provisions outlined in the ordinance that an election sign would need to comply with. These have to do with the size, height, not presenting a hazard, not illuminated, and the timing for removal. Election signs may be placed on private property with the owner's consent or at specified city property or right-of-way locations. 4 locations have a historical precedent for placement of election signs, and these are shown in this image, and Public Works Director has indicated that more detailed guidance will be provided in the implementation of the ordinance once it's adopted. Posting of election signs on other city-owned properties or right-of-way would not be allowed, so it would be limited to these four or on private property. In closing, staff recommends adoption of Resolution RZ-119, recommending approval of the zoning text amendment to City Council.
Thank you. Any questions for staff? Commissioner Mackin.
Several, Ken. The four locations are heavily weighted towards the ridge, and while usually in what I would call old or central Brisbane, it's across from the community park, illustrated here as location number 4, I would propose consideration for Old County, Tunnel, and Bayshore as being an additional location, especially since Guadalupe, location number 2, is the intersection with Bayshore, according to that photograph. Although on the list, it doesn't show that per se. It says Guadalupe Canyon Parkway and Mission Blue Drive, which is, I believe, location number... none of them, actually.
So I'd go to the actual ordinance language, and we can look at that and make sure we have it accurately depicted. Julia, do you mind turning the lights down a little? So, thank you. So we have the south side of West Hill. So number 1 is the south, and I'm looking at page G36, south side of West Hill Drive, directly opposite Silver Spot. So that's number 1. Number 2, the north side of Guadalupe Canyon Parkway. Oh, I think I've got these mislabeled on this.
Yeah, I think it should just say Bayshore and Bayshore Boulevard on number 2 instead of and Mission Blue Drive.
Number 2, let me see, Guadalupe Canyon Parkway, directly opposite its intersection with Mission Blue Drive. So that, what's shown as location 3 should actually say location 2, right? Or no.
No, location 2.
Location 3, the description's correct, Monarch Drive and Mission Blue. It's number 2 should just say Guadalupe Canyon and Bayshore Boulevard.
Can
I would trust the text. This is the text that was provided by the city attorney and the public works director, and we can modify this map.
If I could just interject one, I'm sorry to butt in on your time, Commissioner. I can tell you that in the last election cycle, there were numerous election signs not where location 2 is on this map, but rather at the intersection of Mission Blue and Guadalupe Canyon. Okay. Whether that's legitimately a public space that's approved for signs, I can't.
That was the intent of this ordinance. Location 2 is mislabeled.
That's right. Well, it's in the wrong place.
Mislabeled.
Yes.
Yeah. Okay. Yes. Thank you.
Got it. Okay.
Okay, so then I would still recommend perhaps at Tunnel, Old County, and Bayshore to really be technically on the side of Tunnel and Bayshore.
So you're talking on the east side of Bayshore.
Correct. Thank you for that. And someone may disagree, and you might ask why. I'll say why. One thing I did not see included was any reference to utility or light poles. And I do recall some elections where they were attached to traffic islands on Bayshore onto light poles or signage. So I would like to see some language to prohibit attaching to utility or light poles. if that's not there. I didn't see it, so maybe I just missed it. And then also what are typically referred to as real estate A-frame or two-sided signs. I saw no mention of that in signage, so I think that needs to be dealt with, either that it's approved or that it's prohibited, because sometimes those are like real estate signs. They get put up on the traffic islands out near Bayshore and Old County. And also, there was no mention of banners. So the not to exceed 10 square feet theoretically could be a 10-foot long banner, 1 foot high. Do we allow banners? Because there's nothing dealing with something that has to be tied. It just talks about freestanding. And if banners are allowed, what's the maximum width? And that would come into play where it talks about on private property that there's no limit to a 3-foot height limit. So could someone theoretically put a huge banner on the side of a building, which they've done before in elections in San Jose, I read about. So I'm just saying these are things that maybe there should be language in here
So
talking about that.
starting on the first item, then the utility poles
Yes.
on page G36.
Okay.
D. So we have D towards the bottom of that page. An election sign shall not be placed on any utility poles nor on any public property or right-of-way except as follows.
I would say no utility poles. I don't see why we should be allowing that, because
That's what the language says. That's
Right.
a prohibition. They're prohibited on.
oh, shall not.
utility
Okay.
poles.
Sorry, I read it as okay. Yes. Thank you.
So the two-sided signs, I would say that's so these locations are such that I would envision them being stuck in the ground because they're intended for traffic to see, and they're not really like a real estate sign where they're going to be up for a day. They're going to be up for a couple months typically or so.
But I'm just saying someone could feasibly say, I'm going to put a two-sided sign at the curve across from the community park, and is that allowed?
I would say yes. Yes, if
So-
it meets the size criteria and
Right.
if it's affixed properly so it doesn't create a hazard,
Right.
which
I
is
would
one
just
of the conditions.
mention it specifically, because those are also sometimes prone to blowing away in the winds that we have. If you see the real estate signs in the street out at Bayshore. So that's why I'm saying, should that be allowed or not? Someone should think about that.
So if you would like to have a suggestion
Yes.
that includes council's consideration that sandwich board signs be prohibited. I don't think I would prohibit two-sided signs, because you could have a two-sided sign that's the type you stick in the ground and see from a car either direction.
Right. It's a matter of semantics, because everybody has, it seems, a different name for those real estate signs. A-frames, sandwich signs. I mean, I've heard all different kinds of terms.
Right. So
And-
so we can put a recommendation if that's the planning commission's desire. Likewise, we can include a recommendation for a fifth location if that's your desire.
In regard to banners, I mean, under this ordinance, there's nothing that would prohibit someone doing a 10-by-1 banner if it meets the size criteria and the height limit. So again, if you want to suggest that banners not be permitted, that's your option. That wasn't part of the ordinance as envisioned.
Okay, and then also on under your discussion points, number 5, be removed within 5 days following the election by the person who placed the sign. What are the consequences if they don't follow? Because usually I see a week, 2 weeks later, and the signs are all still there.
So I would, my usual answer is enforcement, but I think
Right.
in the case of public locations, you'd probably just have a public works crew remove them. And
Why should we be paying for removal of signage? I think whoever put them there should be charged back if they don't remove them.
And this may be an implementation question that goes to the city engineer, who would also be providing for guidance. And there's also they'll have a form, as I understand, for a campaign or for a candidate to sign up front to indicate that they're agreeing to remove them within that time period.
So it would be very simple to add a line that says if the signs are not removed in compliance of the 5 days, they'll be removed by Public Works, and the cost to remove them will be charged to you, and have them sign it that they agree to that, and I'll bet the signs all get removed.
Yeah, I think that's a fine suggestion. We'll pass that on to the city clerk and the city engineer, who will be ultimately administering this kind of permitting process on these public sites.
Not to be heavy-handed,
idea.
but just a bit of an incentive,
No,
because it seems to be an ongoing.
Yeah, I
Just
think that makes
just a follow-up on that. Let's say someone is a supporter of a candidate and without the candidate's approval puts up all these signs. Is the candidate responsible then for taking them down?
I would assume, just as a discussion, if I'm the candidate and I see the sign and I know someone put it there, I'd make sure I removed it along with all of my other signs.
Yeah, I think again, there's somebody who's responsible for the placement of the sign, and whether or not it was done in terms of this permitting process, which is administrative, which isn't covered under this ordinance. That person, whether they have the consent of the candidate or not, they're the ones who are reaching out to the city, getting the approval to put that sign up. As far as we're concerned, they're the ones who are obligated to follow the rules for its removal. Not the
But what
candidate
if
per se.
someone doesn't go through the process of getting a permit and they're just acting in a rogue fashion, just putting up signs?
And that does happen,
Yeah.
right? There's a lot of handmade signs.
You're thinking public and private property, or just public property?
Public.
Public, okay.
Mm-hmm.
Kind of thinking about this, I think you already have this kind of situation happening, and I'm imagining, I don't work in Public Works, but I'm imagining that Public Works already has probably removed those signs after a certain amount of time, after elections that don't get removed. And I'd go further, I guess, to say that I think you might end up spending more trying to enforce a set of rules than it actually takes to remove the signs after an election.
Yeah, I only bring it up because if we're going to fine people, we might be unfairly fining a candidate who has no control over the actions of others. That's my only concern. I mean, if the city is going to take on the cost of taking out the signs, that's one thing, but
I'm not aware that, again, historically, that the city has ever fined anybody for illegal campaign signs or failure to act or failure to remove that. Again, I don't. Theoretically, we could do that, but again, becomes, as Ken mentioned, sort of a cost benefit, and again, probably the cost of the city just handling this, and might be cheaper than them even trying to bill back to somebody for that time. And certainly, the idea of fining somebody and going through a court proceeding or whatever, or the collection of that isn't something the city, I can't expect, would be interested in doing unless there was some horribly egregious sort of violation or flaunting of city rules or procedures, which we haven't historically seen.
Just something that in past years that I observed is that when it comes time for an election, there are what appears to be independent contractors that go out in trucks and they put signs up, and they will indiscriminately put them on power poles, light poles, with tape, with all kinds of materials. And even if you have this ordinance that says you shouldn't put them on utility poles, blah, 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 weeks later, they're still there. So I don't know who's taking them down. So I'm just suggesting that if a candidate hires or has a group of volunteers for their campaign putting the signs up, that the candidate be made aware you could be charged for removal if you don't go back and remove them. Because on those utility poles, someone's going to have to take them down. And sometimes they're way high up. I've seen them stand on the top of trucks to get those way up high. So it's just kind of more of, I'm thinking of something to make it more of an incentive that they take responsibility.
Yeah, I think, again, if the commission, you have the ordinance in front of you. If you have some thoughts as to what you would recommend to the council in terms of an administrative procedure that isn't embedded in the ordinance, but you want to offer those opinions to the council and that suggestion to the council, you have that opportunity to do that as part of whatever action you take tonight.
And through the chair, I just a matter of form, I don't think we've opened the public hearing technically and closed it. We've got kind of into discussion, so.
Okay.
Which we tend to do.
Okay, I think we, yes.
I do have one comment whenever it's appropriate.
Okay, go ahead, Commissioner Gooding, since we're all...
May as well beat the horse to death. This is my grumpy old man comment on this issue, which is I think election signs are unsightly and add or make probably zero contribution to meaningful political debate. So now, my education and training have given me a deep, abiding respect for the First Amendment, and folks on their property can put up whatever they want within, reasonable size restrictions. But I cannot, with all due respect, support having more public places for more unsightly stuff that I think adds nothing to meaningful political debate. It's just an annoyance and presents all these post-election problems of who takes them down. If somebody wants to take some of the ones on the ridge and move them down to Brisbane, take them. I'm done. Thank you.
Okay, now I think we will open up the public hearing. Is there anyone who would like to speak on this issue?
Step on up here.
Sure. Commissioners. Been in Brisbane the last 3 years. I was actually involved in a campaign here in Brisbane. And I actually remember a couple days after the election and being amazed that all the signs had disappeared. From talking to Brisbane election officials and being involved in a campaign, there are these unspoken rules, which are actually all the written rules that are being proposed to you that seem to already be followed. So it seems like if you approve this proposal, you'll be codifying what's already kind of an unspoken agreement among the politicians or the council members or those involved in politics here in our town. So just wanted to bring that perspective.
If I may clarify, the candidate signs are gone. It's the yes on this, no on that are always remaining, because those are county people that come in and put those up, and they don't think about coming back to Brisbane.
Okay. Well, I was thinking about the last JJ
But
election.
you're correct.
Okay.
A lot of the political candidates, they do remove them.
Okay.
Okay, thank you.
You're welcome.
Yes, please come up. Oh.
So it sounds like when it's a county election. Okay. Thanks for clarifying that. You did say something, Commissioner Mackin, that these are heavily weighted towards the ridge, and I wasn't sure if we got back to that topic. Is there no other place in Old Brisbane that has a public place or city-owned property that we could put signs or?
It doesn't have the same visibility, and I figure if it's a national election, signs are going to appear out there on Bayshore. So to say this is where they belong is a lot better than having them appear all over near the shopping center and on the traffic islands. Just to say this is it. This is where they go, and if they're not there, they're going to be taken down.
Okay, so it's just designating the proper places. Okay, thank you.
Thank you. Commissioner Gomez?
There's more of a comment because I didn't catch the county piece, Commissioner Mackin. So is there anything, as we're thinking about this topic, that we could actually state something around how, if there are county-wide propositions and that ends up being a nuisance, some sort
and statewide.
Or statewide, yeah. And maybe there is something already there we're just not aware of.
I'd be very hesitant, I think, as the attorneys at the dais would understand about sort of regulating content and saying that somehow you're going to treat signs for a local or county or statewide or federal differently. That's not anywhere the city attorney's going to want to go.
That's not what I was. So I miscommunicated that. What I was trying to say is, if there are actors that put signs representing those campaigns that are a countywide effort or a statewide effort or even a federal effort, that there is some sort of way to hold those actors accountable if said signs end up being left in public spaces, right? That's kind of where you were going, right?
Well, I think you're bringing up a really good question, because if we have an ordinance regarding election signs, how do we communicate this to the state political parties or someone supporting a proposition that's statewide or a county proposition? How do they know what every city has in terms of sign regulations, or do they care? Do they bother to? So I'm assuming they don't care. They come in on those trucks. I've seen them stand on the trucks with the tape and the staple guns, and they don't seem to care. So it sounds like this ordinance is really, well, it's a zoning text amendment, is going to provide for our local candidates and maybe local issues, but it's not going to do anything about the wider problem.
Yeah, and I don't know. Having been here going on 8 years, I haven't monitored, I haven't seen that impact from, I've paid attention to what's going on locally, but I haven't seen that interface between what's going on county, state, and perhaps federal that would somehow show up in town from a campaign perspective. So I can't really speak from a very informed. I think it's an interesting point that you bring up. I just don't know what the remedy would potentially be.
I don't know that we're going to solve it. I think that this starts boiling down to, this is informational for people that ask.
Right.
They come to the city and say, what are the regulations on election signs? Here it is. And other than that, the same stuff that's always happened is going to happen.
Okay, I forgot we need to make a motion to close the public hearing first, I think.
So moved.
All in favor?
Aye.
Okay, now we can discuss.
We haven't already discussed?
Yes.
Can I ask one question for my own information? I don't know if you folks know this, but are there any countywide regulations? It wouldn't be zoning, but it would be a county ordinance, presumably, governing political signage.
Not that I'm aware of.
I mean, it sounds like we're doing this because each municipality has to come up with its own. And what's before us tonight is whether do we recommend something to the council or not.
Yeah, it's it's a local decision on how a lot of cities don't allow any signs within the right of way. They're all illegal signs and they can be pulled down, but that's a city by city sort of thing, and how you want to regulate them on private property in terms of size or whatever, that's within the city's police power, and some cities do and some cities don't.
So there are some cities that allow only private property political signage. Okay. Thank you. That's helpful. I'll just refer to my previous grumpy statement on that issue. Thanks.
Okay, Commissioner Mack.
So I guess on the board as question, as Ken has pointed out, do we want to provide any recommendations that go beyond what we've been provided? A-frame signs, banners, additional sign locations.
The additional sign location is an intriguing point that you brought up, Commissioner Mackin, with regard to, I believe you said Tunnel and Bayshore on the east side of Tunnel. That's from a First Amendment standpoint and from a public visibility standpoint, that's intriguing. And I'm not sure about Bayshore and San Bruno, and if there's actual public, because that's also a busy, movement area. That's a little ways up, south. It's not here visible on the map we can see, but that's also an intriguing location if there is public space. But you might disagree with me. And
Yeah.
that's okay, that's good. I hadn't thought about that. You're the one that put the idea in my head. So
Only because they could be set back from the street. There's
Yeah.
that little area with all the trees. So
right, yeah, it makes sense. No, man.
I mean, I'm kind of leaning towards what Commissioner Gooding was saying, is that, okay, we're providing the public with some locations for them to put up their election signs, but it is an eyesore, and it's just, and I think of all the waste when I see the signs and all the paper, and
Yeah.
it's sometimes it's too much. I think offering public locations is good. I don't think we have a duty to provide more. That's kind of where I'm leaning.
Okay.
just one comment to that is in the past, where the propane businesses further down,
Right.
signs have appeared all the way along there.
Okay.
And the trailer park, all of that, they've appeared. So if we say, this is it, this is your spot, that's all. No more.
Right.
But then you think they would comply? I mean, if you're giving them one more space.
Got to start somewhere.
I'm all for the recommendation of no banners and, the A-frame signs, whatever that you discussed. I just don't know if offering more locations, I think people that are going to do it illegally are still going to do it. I wouldn't mind taking one from a certain location, putting it elsewhere, but I don't know about increasing the public locations, for the signs.
So am I reading it right that basically what the staff suggests as a recommendation to the council would be to codify the status quo? Is that fair? So to that extent, I wouldn't oppose that because we're not really changing the landscape much. I'm probably in the minority about my grumpiness on the general issue, but it is what it is, and we've been doing it that way for years, and so be it. Let's set it in stone so it can be enforced. That's my
Yeah, so
final word.
So how strongly are you two in favor of, you want the additional location, like, is that?
No, my response was more so it did seem kind of heavily weighted towards the ridge, and it just seems like, yes, okay, the old county across from the park there's a lot of movement there, a lot of people, but then I was also thinking about south of town. That's why I brought up San Bruno and Bayshore.
That's why I brought it up.
Look, I can go either way.
Yeah.
I can go a lot
I
of
could
different
too.
ways on this
I
topic,
could too.
to be quite honest.
I had the same. I looked at the ridge and said, why are these all in Doug's neighborhood?
Right.
Bothering him.
And then we're just
Let's share the pain
Share the misery,
and move
yes,
them out.
okay.
To not be flippant, locations 1 and 3 on this map are not particularly high traffic zones other than spill out from the ridge, and that's repeated essentially by location 2 when you move it to where it really is. So, if we wanted to start, micromanaging this, 1 and 3 might be moved downtown someplace where there's more exposure and you have the same net number of sites. I don't know if that's worth the trouble to re-engineer or not. But I think you could do that and have the same number of spots.
I mean, I don't want to increase the locations, but I do agree with your point that if you're going to have public locations, it should be fair in how it's dispersed.
So what if location 1 was removed, which is the most obscure location, and it was just location 3 remains, location 2 remains, 4, and we add one more somewhere in central Brisbane? Then it's even.
Fine with that.
I could go with that.
Yeah.
Yep, that's fine.
So we'll add that to the recommendation.
And maybe there's some sort of public right-of-way location in the visitation area or San Bruno Avenue area that might be amenable for that.
Sounds good.
If there's a lot of traffic near the school, for example, if there's public right-of-way near the school, we'll get visibility, whatever.
Okay, so who wants to craft this recommendation?
I'll give it a shot.
Okay.
But we, what's this one numbered, please?
Yes, this one.
I would move that the commission forward a recommendation to the City Council to adopt the staff's proposed signage zoning implementations with the one change that we relocate current location 1 to a downtown location on some public right-of-way that the staff would recommend as favorable for high visibility.
And do you want to include something about A-frame signs or banners, or just leave it alone?
I don't have a dog in that hunt.
I'm not stuck on that. I'm okay if we just leave it alone.
I'm okay with leaving it alone.
Okay.
If it becomes a nuisance, I'm sure we'll have to revisit.
Okay.
So is that motion workable?
Mm-hmm.
Okay, can I have a second?
I second.
All in favor?
Aye.
Aye.
Okay. Next item on the agenda is items initiated by staff. We have a request here to initiate a plan line for establishment of right-of-way within the Brisbane Acres in the area south of Kings Road, pursuant to Brisbane Municipal Code Chapter 12.06, plan lines for right-of-ways. Staff, may we have a report?
Yes, thank you. This item is for the city to initiate the process for establishment of plan lines for right-of-ways in a portion of the Brisbane Acres that's located to the south of Kings Road, or uphill from Kings. The Brisbane Acres sub-area originated as an unrecorded subdivision in the 1930s, and subsequent land transfers by deed description resulted in various individual ownerships. That unrecorded subdivision was also created a number of roadway parcels, most of which are not dedicated to the city as public streets, so they're in private ownership still. To date, development within the acres has largely been limited to what are referred as to the lower acres, which are those that are closer to city infrastructure. And in recent years, the city has been acquiring a number of the upper acres, as you see in green here. And this is just the western portion of the Brisbane Acres shown on this image. And those are for purposes of creating habitat or leaving habitat open for butterflies. Property owners in the Brisbane Acres face a number of technical challenges to development of their land, not least of which are the required public improvements to serve the development. Recently, the property owners for 3 unrecorded lots in the lower acres have been in communication with the city about potentially subdividing and developing their lots, and these are lots 89, 90, and 91. They're located, you can see in the orange color there, just above Kings. And there's private driveway and easement access through 450 Kings Road and the vacant 462 Kings Road lot. And that runs up to 88 Beatrice, and it also splits off to other properties along Kings Road, accessing from the backside. So the owners of these 3 lots have sought preliminary city feedback on project design and public infrastructure requirements, including the provision for roads. These ongoing discussions have raised a number of concerns, and a particular concern is the focus of this item before you tonight. And that's the challenge of ensuring that the the future development sites are served by a public street system and meets the city standards. And such would need to accommodate emergency vehicle access and allow for public utilities as well. Establishment of these plan lines would provide a couple key benefits to the city and to the property owners. From the city side, it would allow for the city to proactively and comprehensively plan and establish locations for the right-of-ways and not just address it on a piecemeal basis. The second is establishment of plan lines would provide for a greater certainty for property owners and preparation of their plans. So the map you see is intended just to show the general context, but more detailed mapping would be provided at a later date. And that would be for public hearing at the Planning Commission, and then it would go on as a recommendation to City Council. So this is just to initiate that process. We're not getting into the details at this time, but the City Code allows essentially or prescribes that it be initiated by the Planning Commission as one of the options for initiation. So in closing, staff recommends that the Commission adopt Resolution PC 119 to initiate this plan line process for right-of-ways. And I'll add one last note. Actually, one of the commissioners asked about a number of questions this afternoon pertaining to the process for the city to establish public streets. And under the current code provisions, the city would require a new home to be served by a public street and does not permit multiple homes to be served by a single private driveway. Such new streets would be provided by the developer, so they would pay for that, and it would be dedicated then to the city. And that would be as conditions of approval in their planning applications that would come before you. So with that, I'll take any questions.
Thank you, Ken. Mr. Gomez, you have a question?
Yeah. I was also, and this was very informative, reading this and then doubled down with the presentation, so thank you, Ken. I'm also under the impression not only would the developer be required to finance, the proper road, transportation infrastructure, but also said infrastructure, city, water, et cetera, right?
That's correct.
Okay. All right. So my previous information that I had in my head was still correct. Okay. That's really was my kind of key concern. I guess if we recommend the approval of this resolution, then that would require further studying on what volume of infrastructure would be necessary relative to how many dwellings could potentially be put up here. We
won't get into that level of detail. This is more akin to a general plan level of planning, so you'll have a map essentially more detailed than this, but it keeps it at a higher level. And once actual applications come before you, that's when you'll get into that level of detail.
Okay.
So this will just be a step higher of detail in the mapping, so showing the parcels and where those, the width of what the right-of-way would be, that kind of.
It's a framework on what could potentially happen.
Right,
okay.
right.
Okay, thank you.
Anyone else? Commissioner Mackin?
A couple questions, Ken. On attachment A, approximate alignments for plan lines. So let me start with the one that's between, it's hard to read, it looks like 450 and 462 vacant, where that arrow intersects Kings Road. Is this suggesting that at some point that could in fact be made into a road?
Yes, in fact, currently there is an easement for a driveway, and the city also gains access to a water tank that's up the hill. So there's already a driveway there over private property. So this it might reconfigure it somewhat, but it would establish this as a public road once development actually happened. So it would set the plan lines for where that future road and other infrastructure would follow.
Okay, so then the only other question comes to mind is looking at the same plan and the red arrows running along Beatrice, which is a private road. How can the city designate right-of-way on a private road? Because you said they can't do that to satisfy a development.
Well, actually, what happens is, what we're suggesting is that as part of anybody's development, they have a legal obligation to provide a public road. So that's incumbent upon the developer. As development is more privileged than a right in terms of subdivision and whatnot. So that's just one of the obligations that come with developing property, is to improve public street access and provide utilities within a public right-of-way. So those are obligations that run with the developer and the future development.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you. Any other questions? No? Okay. Someone want to make a motion?
To close? Or
Oh, no. I don't need you to have just to adopt the resolution.
Okay. I make a motion that we adopt resolution PC-1-19.
I second the motion.
All in favor?
Aye.
Okay, next is a workshop.
Oh, through the chair, I do have one other just commission item. It's not on the agenda.
Oh, okay.
But just give you a heads up that at the last city council meeting, a couple of things. One is they did direct the commission to consider retail cannabis uses, and so that will come back to the commission later this summer or early fall, depending on how that works out. And then the other thing is they did direct that the commission or appoint 2 members. The council has a Bayland subcommittee consisting of 2 city council members, and they've requested that 2 planning commissioners be appointed to that Bayland subcommittee. And so that will be on your agenda for next meeting for you to go through that selection process. And I'll provide more detail at that point.
Okay, thank you. Before we start the workshop, let me read the appeals process. Anyone may appeal the action of the Planning Commission to the City Council, except where specified otherwise. Appeals shall be filed with the City Clerk not later than 15 calendar days following the Commission's decision. Exceptions to the 15-day filing period include the following. Appeal shall be filed with the City Clerk within 6 calendar days of the Commission's actions for use permits and variances, and 10 calendar days for tentative maps and advertising sign applications. Okay, now we'll go on to workshop concerning short-term rentals ordinance. Can we have a report?
Sure. So tonight I'd like to introduce Emilio Flamenco, who is our returning intern. You may recall him from last summer as well. We're very lucky to have him back. He just finished his first year at Columbia in his graduate program for urban planning. So he'll be helping with the presentation tonight and prompting your discussion of these very important issues. So Emilio, take it away.
Good evening, Chair and Commission. First off, let's begin by defining what a short-term rental is. Short-term rentals, or STRs, as you'll hear me refer to them as throughout the night, are rentals of a room or an entire home for a period of less than 30 days. Under the city's current municipal code regulations, this use is considered a hotel use, subject to a transit occupancy tax, and is not permitted in residential zoning districts. There are 2 primary criteria to be considered a commercial hotel use, the first being that the operator receives some form of compensation, and the second being that the guest stays for less than 30 days. Here are some examples of situations that are not short-term rentals. Home swaps, or offering a spare bedroom to a friend or a family member at no charge, does not meet the criteria of a STR because the resident isn't compensated for sharing their time and space. As you're all aware, online apps have made short-term renting easier and more lucrative than ever before for homeowners, with the most popular platforms for these transactions being Airbnb and HomeAway, among others. At the February 7th City Council meeting this year, following 4 years of discussion, community outreach, and research, Council directed staff to prepare a draft STR ordinance and for the Commission and public to review. Our workshop tonight will review the ordinance elements already identified by the Council and other policies the Commission may want to consider. Per Council's direction, the STR ordinance will contain a residency requirement. This means that operators of STRs must reside on the property as their primary place of residence. This requirement is intended to ensure more orderly operation of STRs and minimize common neighborhood nuisance concerns. The City Council has directed that any Brisbane STR ordinance allow hosted rentals with no time limits. Hosted rentals occur when rooms are rented by the resident while the resident is physically occupying the property. Hosted rentals are usually associated with fewer noise complaints or other issues due to the presence of the resident on site. In unhosted rentals, the resident is not physically present on site. Council has indicated that this type of rental should be limited to anywhere between 30 to 90 calendar days per year. This is intended to allow reasonable rentals of entire homes or rooms in the resident's absence, like while they're on vacation, while preventing business entities or investors from buying dwelling units and using them exclusively for STR use. Doing so removes dwelling units from the city's permanent housing supply and exacerbates the housing crisis. Council has also directed that STRs be subject to business licenses and transit occupancy taxes, which is currently set at 12%, just like any other hotel use. The STR ordinance will require neighborhood notification and compliance with good neighborhood policies, which address check-in routines, parking, quiet hours, and waste management. Failure to comply with good neighbor policies would be grounds for permit revocation. And finally, the STR ordinance will require homeowners to prove that they are adequately insured. Beyond those directives from Council, let's review some other STR considerations that have come up in staff's research of other cities' ordinances, as well as in past public comment. We'll allow for Commission questions and discussions for each individual item. If there are any other considerations the Commission or members of the public would like to present, they are welcome to do so following staff's presentation. Let's start off by discussing the role accessory dwelling units, or ADUs, play in this conversation. While the Council's Planning Issues Subcommittee had previously recommended banning STRs and ADUs to preserve them as a permanent part of Brisbane's rental housing stock, at the February 7th City Council meeting, public comment was given in support of allowing STRs to operate in ADUs. Supporters argue that it enables residents to earn supplemental income without the complications and commitment of taking on a long-term lease. Furthermore, because the STR manager lives on the same property, it allows the manager to respond more quickly to noise complaints or any other issues the neighbors or city might have. Some potential drawbacks to allowing STRs and ADUs include the aforementioned displacement of availability for long-term rentals. It's worth noting that in the 2015 community survey, the majority of respondents at the time supported allowing STRs and ADUs. We'd like to draw your attention to the supplemental table provided in the memorandum, which details more information on this matter. From that document, you can see that most jurisdictions do not allow STRs and ADUs. This is in line with the 2015 recommendation from the Planning Issues Subcommittee. At this point, we'd like to open the discussion on this first point for the Commission to discuss this matter.
Okay, thank you. Anybody want to start? Mr. Mackin?
Just my comment, I think ADUs are a valuable new configuration we have to address housing problems, and turning them into short-term rentals is totally the antithesis of what they were designed for, not to mention the fact that they're exempt from parking regulations, and then to turn them into a short-term rental, where's the parking? So I'm totally against that. I think that short-term rentals are like hotels, and an ADU is given special privileges that should not be afforded to converting them to short-term rentals.
Yeah, I agree with everything Commissioner Mackin said. Anybody else would like to comment?
No, I also agree. I think that the biggest issues we have in this county and state are housing. and allowing ADUs or even people's regular residences to become short-term rentals, I think is just the wrong direction. It's a private enterprise thing. I suppose people should be able to use their property some reasonable way, but in an area that's so burdened by a housing shortage, it just seems like the wrong direction. If there's a way to accommodate some amount of it in some way with some restrictions, that might not be unreasonable, but I think that becomes very, very difficult in the details.
I'm going to counter intention. I'm thinking, one, do we have an active inventory of all ADUs in town?
We do have an inventory of ADUs that have received permits since like the late 80s.
Okay.
There are probably more units that are operating out of existing non-conforming like duplexes that we don't all know about. But
right. That's kind of where I was going. So I'm just wondering, there's an emerging trend across many fronts to encourage the legal development of these ADUs, and we've talked about the housing crisis tonight, and I'm just wondering if we look at does not, how do I articulate this, does not allowing ADUs to serve as short-term rentals somehow stymie investment in ADUs, meaning that will continue having kind of non-conforming livable space in town? Because to my knowledge, there are people that are renting space, whether they're using, whether it's short-term or long-term, right? Whether it's conforming or non-conforming. And I'm just wondering if putting this type of restriction on an ADU will actually do the inverse of what we want to see, which is more ADUs. And this is me thinking out loud. I could be totally off base here and illogical. Because I see your points. I'm trying to contribute to a bit more intellectual friction here.
Yeah, I just think that an ADU that is a short-term rental is not an ADU that addresses the housing shortage. And so stymieing people's investments in ADUs that are not intended to address the housing shortage is not a bad idea to me.
Okay.
And I think, they are getting a benefit if they legalize their units. They can still rent it out. They can still get income. So I don't think preventing them from turning it into a short-term rental would stymie that. I think people will still be motivated by the additional use that it could provide. So.
Okay.
Am I allowed to add?
Sure, come on up.
Just since we're having an intellectual discussion here, when you have a legal unit that directly goes to the assessed value of your house, which in turns impact how much you would get from either a HELOC or a home equity loan. So there's also that additional incentive to having a legal as opposed to an illegal unit.
Right.
Yeah.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
Mm-hmm.
Okay.
Okay,
All right.
next topic.
Moving right along, let's continue and discuss the different options available for the permitting process. There are two buckets of options. Discretionary permits offer the highest level of oversight and would require zoning administrator or planning commission approval. The other option would be ministerial permits, which are issued by and processed by city staff. Desired performance standards per the commission's discussion would apply to either discretionary or ministerial processes. Attachment B on the memorandum provides information on how the city's staff research regulated their permit processes. Once again, we'd now like to welcome feedback from the Commission regarding their preferred options and opinions on the permitting process.
Okay, anyone want to start? Permits? No?
I don't really have any.
Commissioner Mackin?
I'm trying to find my notes.
Okay.
Should be attachment B.
Right, but there were some references to it prior to that. Let me see. Yeah, the B is the comparison, but there was reference to it in. Give me 1 second.
Maybe while Commissioner Mackin's searching, I can just make a brief comment.
Okay.
It seems to me that this area is fraught with minefields and pitfalls about what to allow and not to allow. And I would, in general, as a policy issue, prefer a ministerial process where administrators don't have a whole lot of leeway as long as the regulations are clear enough and that there's a clear path for it. Otherwise, I see a lot of potential for neighbors disputing your discretionary rulings on applications and so forth ad infinitum or causing some discord in the community. That said, it might be really tough to make really clearly defined standards for these, because our city is so bizarre in its lot sizes and heights and widths and all that kind of stuff. But in general, the less discretion, the better, I think.
I agree. I mean, I trust, you have the experience. I would think, I trust you to come up with a permitting process, that would be, reasonable. But, but I would remove the discretion and keep it as streamlined as possible.
The middle ground that is used for certain procedures that you don't get involved with is where staff serve as a zoning administrator function, where there is an opportunity for the public to have their say, but it's basically a staff level decision, not coming to the commission. It's usually less costly to have that than certainly a commission, a full conditional use permit process. But if there's the desire to let people have sort of an opportunity to express their opinion about that, that's kind of the middle ground that keeps them out of this venue. If you're not kind of wanting to go with a full ministerial thing where if they meet the 10 or 12 or however many performance standards. So, I want to make you aware of that. It's probably a procedure you don't normally follow.
Well, and we talked about a zoning administrator reviewed process when we talked about the Crocker Park zoning amendments last month. So there are provisions in our code for, when someone applies for a type of permit that's subject to that process, adjacent neighbors are sent mailed notices basically saying your neighbor has applied for this type of permit. Please send any comments on the merits of this to the zoning administrator given the given time frame. And then the zoning administrator basically acts on the application given that input, and then that decision could be appealed by anyone who submitted written comments. They'd be notified of the outcome, and they could then appeal if needed to. And there's other ways the ZA process could be tweaked that wouldn't involve a full-blown public hearing, but would still require notification of neighbors prior to action being taken.
Okay, I found the page I was looking for. I was looking at it's 1.13 or I 1.13 attachment A, and it compares the city of St. Helena, which is discretionary process, and then 1.12 talks about San Francisco, which is ministerial, and I noted good and bad on both. The part I liked about St. Helena was that it says if 30% or more of neighbors submit a written protest, the application is subject to review by the Planning Commission. I had a little problem with 30% because it depends on the area. But I felt that was worthwhile, then it goes for a hearing. But the ministerial on City of San Francisco seemed really very straightforward going through the regulations. So part of me says I'd like to see a combination of both. Because the discretionary, it notes the way they did it in St. Helena. If it's 30% or more of neighbors, submit a written protest. Or if the owner is not a natural person, i.e. corporate entity. The application is subject to review by the Planning Commission for consistency with findings of approval for a conditional use permit. And that the Planning Director and Planning Commission's decisions may be appealed to the City Council. So I'd be looking for staff comments on whether there's a way to incorporate. I didn't see anything in San Francisco's about offering that. And I think where we're in a city with some unusual street configurations where some neighbors may just say this just is not appropriate here and have strong objections, and I think parking is going to be the issue that triggers it. The ability to appeal and say, you might go, well, that just opens a can of worms and you're going to have tons of appeals. But if you limit the number of short-term rentals that are allowed, you automatically control that. And if you have a limit, just say it's 20. I'm just pulling that out of the sky. Say it's 20. How many new ones do you have? I would assume a lot of these, they stay in perpetuity. So you're not going to be besieged with constant hearings because of a new one coming along constantly. So that's my piece on it.
Well, I think in terms of, the appealable, any process can be built in to have an appeal. I mean, even a ministerial process where arguably it's basically a form letter says, well, this application came in and the planning director determined X. And, if you want to disagree, if you're aggrieved by this finding, you have X days to appeal it. That can be built into any sort of process, whether it's through the zoning administrator or even a straight ministerial. Whether or not you want to kind of put this whole, criteria percentage of people who object. We normally wouldn't think of doing a 300-foot notice for these kind of things. It would be much more localized typically, but, that's another way of doing it. But then, I think the flip side is if you have two property owners who object and somehow they're not able to have an appeal carry because it's not 30% of the neighborhood, there's sort of a interesting marginalization going on there. That's kind of a policy thing for you to decide. But certainly we can build in an appeal process. Pretty much one would be built in, I think, in some fashion.
If we look at this as a hotel within a city in a residential area, let's call it what it is. It's a business. It's a home-based business. And I think the neighbors have a right, if they have an objection, to have the objection heard. So to send a notice, I don't know about 300 feet, but I think the notice should be mailed. Mm-hmm. And I think there should be the means to push it to a hearing. Because once that permit's issued, it's going to be much harder to revoke it. And it's that important to think about if it's your house and that's coming in. I think that's just fair, especially in a small town.
Yeah, I agree. I think notices should be mailed. And then I think it's something that can be addressed by the zoning administrator, and it can be appealed further to us, so I think we can put all that in place. Anybody else?
Maybe this is going backward a step in these options, but it occurs to me that if the council was influenced in part by citizens saying, we would like to be able to supplement our income or make it easier to stay in our home, et cetera, that's one kind of STR. It's renting out a bedroom occasionally to supplement your income, that seems relatively low impact compared to people building ADUs for the express purpose of short-term rentals to essentially run a small hotel. I mean, it's call it what it is. Mm-hmm. And I think they're different animals, and perhaps there's a way to treat them differently in the permitting process or in how many are allowed or under what conditions, because that's not, someone renting out their bedroom now and then doesn't add or subtract from the housing shortage. Mm-hmm. Creating an ADU that isn't alleviating the housing shortage is a different animal.
I think there's a lot of merit to that. I think, as Commissioner Mackin pointed out, an ADU is really at this point kind of a creature of the state of California in terms of how the cities can regulate them, what our limitations are. I think you'd make the argument that the state of California didn't adopt ADU regulations and streamlining for ADUs to accommodate short-term rentals. And if you want to build an ADU that's subject to sort of a streamlined provision and all the kind of the benefits that come with that procedurally, well, that's one thing, and you're living with sort of the obligation that you're helping to sort of ease the housing crisis by some way by having this opportunity and this product that you can make available to your fellow residents. If you would choose to build an STR, a short-term rental on your property, that, if that's something that council and the commission want to allow for, that's great, but there's no reason why the city would have to impose those same or allow for those same relaxed development standards. Or, as you say, they're two different animals, so maybe you create sort of a split path. It's not like I can't do in a short-term rental. Well, you can't use your ADU for a short-term rental, but if you want to build a short-term rental and do these other things that particularly parking, that you might have a different sort of set of requirements for that might not apply to an ADU. That's an option for a property owner to proceed along either path, but that's maybe another way of looking at it.
Yeah, that's exactly it. That's a better way to put what I had in mind.
Okay, next topic.
So some of you had previously discussed parking. Many jurisdictions require additional parking spaces to be provided for short-term rentals in addition to those already required for the main house. During past public outreach, residents voiced concern on the impact of limited parking and increased traffic on the livability of these residential neighborhoods. Given the at times the limited on-site parking in Brisbane's residential neighborhoods, the Commission may want to discuss this further. And again, one of the data points on attachment B addresses how other cities have tackled this issue of parking and STRs.
Yeah, I think Brisbane is unique in that, parking really is problematic. So, I definitely, that's why my position is, with respect to ADUs, I don't think we should have any short-term rentals. And then for, people's homes when they're, letting people, rent out a room or whatnot, I think I think definitely we need to put some restrictions on that because of the parking issue, and that's why I think it's great that we're going to put in give neighbors and whatnot opportunities to voice any of their concerns, because I think this is going to be a real hotbed of an issue. So, anyone else?
One thing that came up in reading about that is within a house, let's say you have a 4-bedroom house and you decide to turn 3 bedrooms into short-term rentals. You're operating a hotel. Do you really have 3 parking spaces? How many spaces were originally required for the home legally by Brisbane Code? And what if, in fact, the one that concerned me is the rental of a home that is not at the time owner occupied, supervised, but a very short term. and let's say they rent the whole house for a week, 2 weeks, and there's 8 people coming in 4 cars. So there's other things I had read where they said you could have no more than 1 bedroom rented in a particular home. So I don't know the solution here, but I think that the parking is going to be the biggest problem.
Yeah, so I'm going to speak from experience as someone who's done a lot of traveling both nationally and internationally, using short-term rentals, never having a car. Okay. But I've also been in situations where we've rented whole houses, and some people had cars and some people didn't, right? So I think it's kind of tricky on how we look at how to set up the right regulatory framework around this, because those were my comments earlier with regard to the ADU request, is that who's to say that person that ends up even having a car? I think we're kind of just assuming that we're going to have this car-heavy culture. From my generational experience, like, we're getting away from that. And so this is an interesting kind of intersection societally that we're having right now, and it's it's revealing itself right here in this beautiful city. And I don't know how to constructively contribute to this conversation around, well, what should we do with parking? What should we not do? If it's a short-term rental, and like your example with a 4-bedroom house, right? Let's say, so someone lives there and they're renting out a couple of rooms and it's short-term. I mean, who's to say that the people renting are going to have a car? They could be taking Uber and public and going, every which way. The majority of people that are using, from my observation, these short-term rentals, right, that tend to be, they've got a mobile lifestyle. They might not even have a car. So I don't have the data on this. I don't know if that's been studied as part of the last 4 years, because this emerged in 2015, right? So I could be a little off base and speculative. I just think it's a little problematic that there's just kind of this inherent assumption that short-term rentals are going to create this massive traffic and parking problem in our city. And I haven't been part of this dialogue, so I'm coming at it a little late, and I just wanted to contribute that to the discussion here.
I think you bring up a great discussion point.
Yeah.
I think we're at a transition time where no one has the answer.
Yeah.
But I would also say, if you were in San Francisco and you had a house with 4 bedrooms, you've got tons of public transportation, usually a short walk.
Right.
In Brisbane, if you're up on Kings Road, are you going to call Uber every time you need to go eat or go somewhere? I kind of doubt it.
So just an observation, because I live kind of on that corridor.
Right.
I mean, I see Uber and Lyft vehicles going up and down the road all day long.
Well, but I'm just saying, if you were visiting,
I don't know.
How many Ubers or Lyfts would you want to pay for versus renting a car?
Yeah.
If you were there.
This is a great question.
And in the future, if we had more transit here, that could be a different thing.
Yeah.
But I think we're looking at right now, look at hotels. How many people stay in hotels and don't have a car? The parking lots are full of cars.
Yeah.
So we're dealing with a hotel, in essence, in a residential area. And I'm just then speaking for the concerns residents have already about parking, and not to overlook that.
And I think you may be right, but I think we also have to prepare for the worst case scenario. So let's say, all these renters, had their own cars. So we have to prepare for that possibility, I think. And what you were, I didn't even think about that someone could rent out 4 of their bedrooms or whatnot, and you can have 4. So maybe we should discuss restricting the amount of renters per home, so that we don't run into that situation. one renter at a time, two renters at a time? I don't know if the city council has thought about that, or they're just wanting us to discuss it.
We'll kind of touch on that in a little bit regarding occupancy limits. But you can certainly, or a city can certainly say in our ordinance that you are restricted to no more than one bedroom, one STR license for one bedroom in one house. I mean, you can tailor it to avoid situations like Commissioner Mackin was describing. And just in regards to parking, I mean, this would be a challenge for a lot of our constrained sites, but you could require that we won't issue an STR permit to a site that doesn't have compliant parking to begin with, like for the existing single-family use. Or you could require that they provide a dedicated additional spot for STRs. Although, again, how many properties in town really have room for even more parking if they can't even accommodate the demand for their existing house? But those are policy choices you could make.
One interesting point on that is that this is where the notification process could be really important, because if you were in an area with a home that already doesn't have the proper parking, and you're a neighbor and you get a notice that they want to turn this into a short-term rental, that may trigger the appeal process where you go, no, this shouldn't happen. And that would take care of itself.
Mm-hmm. That's a good point.
Things for us to study and come back to you with some more recommendations and data on.
Do we have, just a final thought here, do we have any idea of the dwellings in the city, how many are not occupied?
Like how many dwelling units in general are unoccupied currently, our vacancy rate?
Yeah.
It's really low. It's below 2%, right? Near the housing element proper. Yeah, it's less than 5%.
Yeah, I'd say less than 5 or close. It's surprisingly not 0, but it is less than 5, I would say.
Okay. All right. Thank you.
Okay. Thank you.
Oh, please.
I think it's around 3%, actually. And could I add kind of to the overall philosophical conversation that I've been seeing kind of throughout this whole meeting regarding parking and traffic? So I'm on Complete Streets, and this is also an issue we talk about a lot. And one thing I encourage you all as commissioners to think about and grapple with is that we currently don't really have the population density to really support effective mass transit in town. We have commute.org shuttles, which does serve Crocker Park and some commuters who are leaving town for morning and evening commutes. But if we increase the population density, that increases the likelihood that we could have effective mass transit, which then decreases the need for individual car ownership, which also decreases single ride vehicles doing single rides for commuting, and which is in turn currently the number one biggest contributor to greenhouse gas emissions. So these are all things we kind of need to grapple with, because if we increase the density, we may also reach a critical mass at some point where we no longer need parking as much, because we're able to have a more sustainable and larger mass transit system serving our town. So again, this is something just to be aware of and to be thinking about, each of you as commissioners.
Thank you.
Yeah, you're welcome.
All right, moving right along. I think about 7 or 10 minutes ago, the chair brought up occupancy limits, which we'll touch on right now. Many jurisdictions impose occupancy limits on each short-term rental based on the number of bedrooms permitted to be rented. As Julia mentioned, this may make enforcement easier when occupancy limits have been exceeded. For most jurisdictions, the number of people allowed to overnight in an STR is set at 2 people per bedroom, plus 2 additional people if more than one room is being rented. Some cities allow for twice this number during daytime hours, which can be defined usually around 8 a.m. to 10 p.m. If Commission has any thoughts on occupancy limits, they're welcome to share them now.
Can I ask, what's the philosophy, if you will, for allowing twice the number of people during daylight hours? What's inferably going on?
So I think the rationale, when you see cities that have those types of regulations, they're kind of acknowledging the more traditional vacation rental scenario where perhaps people are having people over during the day who will be leaving, in the nighttime, that only people renting the place will be sleeping there. It's really kind of addressing kind of daytime gatherings that may exceed.
Okay.
Say you go to a graduation, you guys rent a house, maybe you guys have a barbecue with other people and then they leave. Okay. It's allowing you to have normal social events without letting those people then stay the night and cause additional nuisance issues.
So we're really using occupancy like you see on the sign from the fire marshal. You could have this many people in the home, but rather than actual residents in the home.
I don't know that it's necessarily a fire code issue, more so as quality of life. But we could make people put up signs.
I'm going to point out, City of San Francisco, only one unit may be registered for each permanent resident. And that's what I would recommend. And I would then attempt to qualify what is the occupancy of a unit. And if we go to one of these, I don't know if it was St. Helena or Palm Desert, designated as 2 people. Here, maximum, it's Palm Desert, maximum of 2 persons per bedroom.
Can you reiterate your first point? So the San Francisco ordinance requirement for one unit per
owner.
Meaning
one property owner's.
I own a property in San Francisco.
Yes.
I own 2 properties in San Francisco. I can only rent one of them out for short-term rentals. Is that what you're talking about?
Well, you get into another discussion as to whether a property owner can own 2 houses and rent units, but if you require owner-occupied, that precludes that.
Or residency requirement. A long-term renter
exactly.
perhaps is.
Right. So that would preclude that. So then if we go back to San Francisco saying 1 unit for each permanent resident, that's pretty clear.
Yes. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, that was one of the council sort of direction to date is to impose a residency requirement.
Mm-hmm.
So that would be consistent.
So if you're not permanently residing somewhere, you cannot.
And owner occupied.
Well, that there is a difference between occupation by a permanent resident, which could be a long-term renter
Mm-hmm.
who lives there
Mm-hmm.
and also wants to occasionally rent out or sublet, I guess, per the terms of their lease, versus a homeowner, property owner, being
right.
the host.
Going back to a renter, I think that is technically a sublease, and I think they're in violation of their rental agreement in many cases. Potentially, maybe not.
Right,
but
you don't.
I don't know that that's a good idea. I'm kind of against that because I don't think landlords would necessarily know what's
You're preemptively getting to, I think, our next slide.
Sorry.
No, that's okay, but as always, you're far ahead of us.
I think there's a policy issue here that, and these are gross generalizations, that tenants tend to care less about the quality of the neighborhood and the property value of the house or the home they're renting than the owner does. And so the notion of allowing tenants to in turn become short-term rental landlords, I think, starts going down a slippery slope of folks who just don't care what's going on and don't care how many cars are on the road and don't care how much noise they're making.
And you would have a renter taking out a liability policy for a property they don't own. Could they even get that?
Yeah, I don't know.
That's a legal technicality right there.
You provided the perfect segue.
Multifamily dwellings. Some jurisdictions, as noted, limit operation of short-term rentals to single-family residential districts only. Staff has provided a supplemental chart indicating which cities surveyed allow short-term rentals in multifamily dwellings. Most do. Past public comment in Brisbane indicated support for operating STRs in multifamily and duplex homes. The potential for good neighbor violations may be perceived to be higher due to the higher density of people in a given development or building. And we'd welcome Commission's discussion of this matter further.
Well, and can I just add too, regarding obviously the city in issuing any permit would require, like for example, council's made it very clear we want proof of adequate insurance from the homeowner. We wouldn't allow, just like we wouldn't allow someone who's not a property owner to submit any planning application. The property owner always has to sign on to a planning application. So a tenant, if they didn't have the permission of their property owner and it wasn't consistent with their lease, wouldn't be able to then submit to us an application with that authorization. So I hear you. There may not be many renters who could do this. Mm-hmm. But do we want to completely exclude those who can and who would have a supportive landlord and a lease that would allow for it from offering part of the unit they rent long-term for occasional short-term rental? I don't know if that helps or makes things more muddled.
So in here, though, I think it states here that there should be adequate insurance. So the renter would have to carry insurance. They wouldn't write off the owner's insurance.
I'm assuming, like, say someone's renting a single-family home, that there's a homeowner's policy that then the property owner would, in submitting and authorizing the application to be submitted, would also need to provide to demonstrate that renting out the short-term rental aligns with their protections under their homeowner's policy. For multifamily dwellings, I can't pretend to be an expert. I assume they also need to have some sort of insurance that we would require proof of.
Actually, that leads to another question, and I confess ignorance. I don't know what the state of the insurance industry is out there. Does anybody know what either homeowners policy issuers or tenants policy issuers are doing about coverage for paying guests as opposed to, I mean, if I invite my cousin to stay over for a couple of nights, he's covered. I mean, whatever happens if it's covered. If I'm running a hotel, to Colleen's point, I can see all kinds of problems about what kind of insurance coverage is adequate or appropriate, depending on how carriers are treating these things. It's kind of, they're a problem in a way. There's no liability for the city, but really, walking people into problems.
Right. They do have short-term rental specific policies that I've seen advertised. It's kind of a growing industry for the insurance market.
Would we be shocked to learn that many short-term rental operators don't get that kind of coverage? But I guess you could require it.
We could require it.
Impose it. We can certainly do some more research on this. I don't think we're going to come to resolution tonight on all these issues to the point where we're ready to draft an ordinance. So this will be one of the things we can provide some additional information when we come back to you.
So back to the point you guys raised here, which we kind of got off of. There is public comment supporting allowing STRs in multifamily dwellings. Does this mean that if I own a duplex, I live in the top unit and there's a bottom unit empty, that I can rent out that bottom unit as an STR? Is that what we're talking about? Or is it some other animal you're describing?
No, I think what we're talking about is just what types of housing will we allow short-term rentals to be operated from?
By anybody. Okay.
So if we want to exclude duplexes and multifamily buildings, that means only single-family dwellings, whether they're long-term rented or owned, would be allowed to operate short-term rentals.
Gotcha. Thank you for the clarification. And so then I got a comment that on the Ridge, for example, 2 of the 3 developments are situations where every residence is in a multi-unit structure, which would be severely impacted by, potential misbehavior or excessive amounts of STR activity. It would be a real big issue. Currently, the CCNRs for both those developments prohibit STRs of any kind for, I think, a really, really good reason. I could give you horror stories of folks who violated it. I won't bore you with it now. But this is a big issue, I think.
Can I throw something in?
There are approximately 350 or so residences up there that would be impacted by this.
So here's something to consider in long-term renters, whether they could do short-term rentals. If I'm a property owner and I own 5 houses, I have tenants renting in all 5, I can have short-term rentals in all 5 units because I make a deal with the renter that you're only going to be there so many days a year, enough to qualify that it's really rented, but that I'm going to be renting it out as a short-term rental, operating these 5 different hotels. That's you're opening a loophole. So I would not allow it in rental units for that very reason.
That probably could be addressed again under the idea of hosted units and non-hosted, because if you're going to, I think the council, that was another one of your issues in terms of how long would you allow a non-hosted rental, to appear. So you're talking about, well, that long-term renter would have to be there 10 months of the year. No, that's, or whatever you would put on as sort of the limitation on a non-hosted rental per year.
San Francisco's done initiatives on that.
Well, because I'm just thinking in terms of enforcement. How are you really going to know? Say you have a lease, and you say this person, okay, you've got a 2-year lease. How do you know they're really there? And if they're coming and going, and it could just be a short-term rental, it would be really easy to do.
Yeah, illegal subletting.
Yes, exactly. And we don't want to create a...
That's already happening all over the place.
Yeah.
Certainly not in rent-controlled San Francisco.
No.
Yeah, I guess the reason, and all my fellow commissioners, I deeply appreciate all your comments, and I feel like we're imagining these horror scenarios, and I'm sure it's like the worst examples of like behavior where you've had these short-term rentals, but it's an industry that is doing very well, and I'm trying to come at this from a very like objective standpoint, and I understand like the concerns here, and this has been ongoing for quite some time now, right? The studying and assessment, and I look at this with the right framework. I think it's a net positive, but we're struggling on a lot of assumptions around behavior and noise and traffic and cars and all of these variables that I feel like none of us are going to create the right set of rules to control. Like, we can try, but I still think there's going to be loopholes. That's my point. And again, I go back to just from my own experience of having traveled in big cities, Boston, New York, internationally, et cetera. I'm not going to go into details. I've done it for conferences. I've done it for vacations, visiting friends, et cetera. Maybe I'm a responsible traveler and I'm the exception to the norm. But I've always found these experiences to be a nice way to like connect with the local community and to understand, to get a better viewpoint versus staying in a hotel. Staying in a hotel is like a sanitized, artificial like experience. It's like the same thing everywhere you go. And these short-term rentals has been a different type of way of traveling, connecting with community. And so I'm just postulating here that this could be, with the right framework around it, and we're talking about the rules right now, and or what we want to see. I think this can be actually a good thing for the community. And I haven't brought that forward because we're talking about kind of these like worst case scenarios, which I think is good. It's a good thought exercise that we kind of extrapolate all the different pitfalls, if you will, of what we do and don't do in this community. But I think the fact that we're talking about it, and we're trying to, put the right, the right framework around all of this is a good thing. And I guess that maybe I'm overly optimistic, but that's where I stand. So I wanted to share that with you all on the record while we're talking about all this.
I could show you an article here. They've done studies on Airbnb, and they can be disputed. But you're welcome to look at this. This is a Mercury News, March 6, 2019, is that short-term rentals tend to drive up rents and housing prices. And to the good experiences you've had, I would just counter that I think we have to be careful, because right now short-term rentals are illegal, and Brisbane, they proliferate. Yeah. And I know of one house, I won't say where, that I was told by someone who lives there that a man recently had bought a house and he was going to put in 6 Airbnb rentals. And he was told, it's illegal. He says, so what? So I think we're trying to acknowledge it has a place and it can be done well, but if we have priorities, we have hotels, we don't have housing, and that would be my goal on putting the restrictions, that we don't have owners creating hotels where we don't need hotels, we need housing.
I echo that 1,000%. I think I've done Airbnbs. I did one in Spokane. Spokane does not have a housing shortage, does not have a parking shortage. It has a hotel shortage when there's graduations going on. So, in certain places, they're great. In the place on the planet that has the worst housing shortage in the history of the civilized world, that should be the priority.
So we have a hotel shortage out here?
No. In Spokane during graduation.
No, so that's my point.
Well, kind of jumping off on what Commissioner Mackin was saying, I live on the ridge where you have these homes that have 4 or 5 bedrooms. Now, I don't want my neighbor to have 4 renters or more in his home, 30, 90 days, whatever that he's allowed for him not being on the property. And let's say my whole street did that. Just one, I think, would probably be very annoying. So that's, I think, the concern that I would have. And
what's the average stay? Do we have data on that? Like of short-term rentals, and that's a big generalization probably.
We do not have, and probably will never have unless we succeed in a court case, to get any data from Airbnb or other providers on the length of stay or any other kind of statistics.
It seems it's more the volume of movement of people versus people actually staying like a month or like that sort of, that seems very peculiar to me, but I'm just speculating. I'm sorry, I know we're going late, and this is the latest I think we've been.
I'll
stop my
we're
comments
going to have
at
lots
this
of
point.
opportunity to discuss.
Because I can see the complexity of this. I'm not.
Mm-hmm. Do you want to?
Yeah.
So here we are on permits, revocation, and complaints. Cities that have adopted short-term rental ordinances thus far all outline penalties, fines, and revocations in their municipal codes. Permits are typically valid for 1 to 2 years before requiring renewal, which may or may not carry a renewal fee, unless complaints are filed and substantiated during that time sufficient to warrant revocation. You can see on the slide before you that we've highlighted a couple of discussion points for the Commission to focus on, starting with should permits expire, first and foremost.
What are your thoughts?
So the permit expiration, I read a lot of different cities, and 2 years seems to be kind of middle ground. The catch with that is that some cities require a building inspection upon renewal, some require a fire department inspection upon renewal. I thought the building inspection was my preferred method of renewal, that it wouldn't just be an administrative renewal, to more or less certify that they haven't reconfigured the interior, created fire hazards. They could always hand it off to the fire department if they felt there was something flagrant. But it would also kind of just serve as notice that you need to really be compliant in the regulations on this.
That's addressed in a slide coming up.
Okay, sorry.
Noting that as a condition of permit renewal, it would require an on-site inspection. Yeah, I think that's definitely a great idea. I think you kind of addressed the second point we wanted you to talk about, which would be if they expire, how do they get renewed? So,
moving on to the issue of management, almost every jurisdiction studied requires a resident, owner, or other responsible party to respond to on-site issues within a given time limit, ranging anywhere from under 15 minutes or up to 1 hour in our research. The designee can be required to be available 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, to respond to a neighbor or city calls. We're going to assume that some sort of manager is desired by Commission, but when it comes to the format of management, response time, and availability, we'll leave that up to Commission's discretion.
and just would be for non-hosted rentals, because obviously in a hosted situation, the permanent resident would need to be there, and they would provide that on-site management.
Yeah, I think within the hour, I mean, if there's an issue, the owner and manager should be available within the hour. You know, I guess their phone or whatnot would, I guess the city would have that phone number.
Correct. So we would require, as part of their registration process, that they provide that emergency or notification contact should something arise when they're not actually on the property. And they'd have to update that over time.
Did I get confused an hour and a half ago? I thought we were leaning in the direction of resident-occupied STRs only.
So council was supportive of limited whole home rentals or whole apartment rentals in the absence of the permanent resident. They thought it should be capped, and they kind of gave a range of maybe 30 to no more than 90 days per year. So this could be like a situation where you rent a house or you own a house, you go on vacation for a week, and you want to, during that time, do it as a short-term rental. That would be allowable under that 30 to 90-day cap, where you could be absent from the property and rent it out.
Boy, policing that is unfathomable.
Yes, there are enforcement issues when it comes to tracking and reporting on how many nights units are rented at all, not to mention whether the host was there or not. I think as we go into the more substantive public hearings for this process, we'll touch a little bit more on the kind of legal precedents that are continuing to be set as we speak. Airbnb is very litigious regarding how cities have been able to, what data the cities have been able to extract from Airbnb and what data they have not. So yes, that is a enforcement issue to be cognizant of, is if we establish these caps on unhosted rentals, how do we actually confirm they're being complied with?
I think it's very telling that Airbnb is so reluctant to share information like this. But that's just my
well, if you ask them, comment. It's First Amendment rights, Fourth Amendment rights, Federal Communications Act. There's a whole bunch of
long history of land use planning being a legitimate use of blah blah blah. I'm preaching to the choir.
If I could just point out that one of the attachment A paragraphs talks about home away as a different lister of second homes and vacation rentals. Most can't meet permanent residency requirements. Differs from Airbnb. Transactions are private between renter and owner. I think we start opening the door, just what Commissioner Gooding said, of people buying homes, saying I'm going to be out of the country, and turning them into, quote, vacation home rentals, and the enforcement is really untenable. Whereas an owner-occupied, owner-supervised short-term rental is much better. My opinion.
Yeah, no, I agree. I think if we're going to allow for the unhosted short-term rental, if we're going to consider it all, I think we'd have to think about a fine so huge that would act as a deterrent, to someone, not following the rules.
And try to prove it, and then you get into litigation.
Yeah.
Whereas, also short-term rentals, current term, go back decades and go to Europe, and they're bed and breakfasts. So bed and breakfasts always were connoted with the owner being the host, being there, supervising. And I think that's the model. That's been kind of a proven model for years.
I sense the philosophical debate is only getting more entrenched, but
Yes.
I think, these are definitely really good points of how we are going to actually regulate these things in our policies. So, points well taken. I think we can move on.
Because short-term rentals follow the same regulations of whichever zoning district they're located in, noise complaints and violations would just follow the protocols already established in the Brisbane Municipal Code. They can also be considered as grounds for permit revocation and penalties. Should Commission have any additional feedback on this, we'd welcome that input now.
Revocation based on what? One noise violation? I think it has to have some specificity. What constitutes a problem? Or it's just, it was just one occurrence. Well, it was one occurrence once a month for a year. It was random. I think you have to put some specificity in that.
I think you get rid of noise problems if you require hosted.
Exactly.
yards.
Good point.
There's a consistent theme to my comments, at least.
Good point.
Okay.
Point well taken. And if there's no further comments, lastly, we were touching on this issue earlier. Many jurisdictions require city staff inspections to confirm compliance with health and safety codes before a permit is even approved. Other cities require self-inspections, some of a voluntary nature, some don't even require any inspections at all. Once again, Attachment B on your provided memorandum offers a comprehensive comparison of other jurisdictions' stances on this, and should Commission like to refer to that in their comments on this, feel free to do so now.
With these inspections, are they normally scheduled, or are they surprise inspections?
So this would be inspections that we'd require prior to granting a permit.
Oh, okay.
Or at least that's what the framework would be. And then, of course, Commissioner Mackin just suggested we also require inspections at time of renewal. I don't know at this point, are you talking about surprise inspections for just for general code enforcement?
Yeah, it's just to see if, if they're following, the rules, while this is occurring.
Yeah, that becomes sort of unless you're going to charge a fee that creates quite a burden on the kind of staffing. I don't know how many of these we'll get, but that's not a normal practice for anything that we do here in terms of surprise inspections or ongoing. It's usually complaint based or on a scheduled, a yearly inspection. So we don't, that's not our practice to do sort of surprise random inspections.
Okay.
In wrapping up, Commission's discussion and feedback tonight will inform staff's drafting of an STR ordinance, which will be scheduled for public hearing at the Commission in August. Thank you for your attention, and we'd like to open the floor now for any additional questions or comments the Commission may have at this time, and the chairperson may also want to take public comment at her discretion.
Okay, thank you.
I do have one item, though, that seemed to come up from Commissioner Mackin that wasn't specifically addressed here, is capping the number of short-term rentals. Is that something that's of commission interest or not? That wasn't something the council, I think there was some back and forth. I don't think they really had a opinion about it one way or the other, so they didn't direct it to be considered, but if that's something you want to consider as well, that's at your discretion.
Yes.
St. Helena noted with a population of 5,800, capped theirs at 25. Since this is a kind of a pilot program, I would suggest Brisbane at 20. Try it out. You can always increase it. Harder to make it go away.
So 20 per year?
No, just 20 permits.
20 permits.
Oh, 20
That's it.
permits.
20 permits.
And you're fully subscribed.
That would expire in 2 years. And
Correct. And then if I could, a couple other things that you hadn't brought up. San Francisco has a short-term rental registry, and they have a registration number assigned with the permit, and all advertisements for the unit must include the registration number. I think that's a really great idea. It prevents illegitimate units from being rented. And there was something else. Let me see. Payment. Revenue capture. The hotel tax, but also I noted Airbnb will collect the fees and the transit occupancy tax, but there are some platforms that don't, and if you rely on the owners to report, I think you're losing the revenue. There's just it's too easy to go, I'm just not going to report a couple, I need the money. So I think that perhaps we consider only platforms that actually capture the revenue be permitted to be used and collect
That's
the tax.
something we'd probably want to run by the city attorney.
Well, because the problem is, and this is where you noted in this report about the other one, I can't remember, is it Home Away that does vacation rentals, and they don't collect anything.
In the
It's
defense of
incumbent
that
on
attachment, it's from 2015, I believe. It's historic information.
Yes.
So
it may not
we
be
should probably
relevant.
verify that that's still the case.
Well, and there was the lawsuit also, which we don't know what the outcome was.
Which lawsuit?
The lawsuit from, I think it was Home Away, saying that they were being excluded by San Francisco because, I'll find it. Hang on. Because they didn't collect it. Give me 1 second. I know where it is. Here, Home Away sued the city and county of San Francisco.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so that was settled in 2017.
And do we know what happened?
Yes. So hosting platforms must agree to verify that units are registered with the city before booking or collecting fees. And they must provide a monthly affidavit to the city affirming they've basically done their best to verify that all hosts are registered.
And I would assume if San Francisco requires a registration number be listed.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah,
Why not?
I mean, my general suggestion would be, why not just try and follow as much as possible with what the city did, but with respect to us being a smaller community, take some of the pieces like you mentioned from St. Helena, the limits. I mean, I think that's going to set us up for the best success. I think there's still a lot of loopholes that can be exposed on something like this, and there's always unintended consequences that are going to be difficult to predict, quote unquote.
One other thing, just because when you talked about nuisance and codes, I would consider one thing, and it could be overkill, is that anyone who is granted one of these permits be required to provide the person they rent to a list of the regulations concerning noise, blah, blah, blah. So just like in a hotel, you got on the back of the door, here's the policies.
Yeah, the good neighbor policy
Yes.
requirement, yes. So part of that is not only having those policies, but providing them to the renter.
Right.
Having the renter agree to them as a condition of booking.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Whether he reads them or not.
Everybody reads.
And one other question. So homeowner insurance requirement, and we've not touched on that. One of the cities mentioned is at $500,000 liability. I would suggest the staff, council, somebody consider whether that's adequate coverage. That may seem okay, but in today's world, that's a drop in the bucket in many cases. And that if a permit is granted, that the homeowner, the host, be required to, on an annual basis, submit their certificate of insurance to the city. Because it's very easy to get a policy and then cancel it once you get the permit.
Okay. I think that's good for tonight.
Oh, no, one more. I'm sorry. Okay, so I read this May 25th, 2019, in the Daily Journal, that the Redwood City Council, at a meeting Monday, agreed to charge an annual fee of $205 per short-term rental fee to offset staff costs.
205?
Like a processing fee?
For all the staff costs to handle short-term rentals.
Yeah, so we would, like any permit application, we have fees associated with it that track with staff time and everything for processing.
But
So we
this
certainly
is an
would,
annual fee.
oh, an annual, I see.
Mm-hmm. So that
To go
because
into a
you're having
specific
to
fund.
send in building inspectors, you're having to process a proof of insurance, there's administrative fees associated. So I think a fee to administer these, because I would assume there's a lot of work with hotels in the same way, make sure the tax is being paid. I think an administrative fee is not unwarranted. Sorry, thought I was done.
No,
No,
thank you.
it's all good points.
Well, thank you very much for the presentation. It was all very helpful.
Good luck.
Okay. Next item is items initiated by the commission. Is there anyone that has anything? No? Okay, I make a motion. The next meeting of July 11, 2019 is canceled, so I make a motion that we adjourn until the next regular meeting of Thursday, July 25th, 2019.
Second.
All in favor?
Aye.
Aye.